Hello everyone, my name is Charlotte and I'll be your host for today. Welcome and thank you for taking part in MDPI's webinar entitled Dietary Patterns, Dietary Behaviour in Children and Adolescents. This is the second webinar in the nutrient series based on a special issue from our journal of the same name. If you are interested in contributing to this topic, don't hesitate to submit your research. Simply check the webinar's webpage for more information. I would like to remind everyone that this webinar is being recorded and the recording will be made available as soon as possible on the webinar's webpage. Today's session is also being live streamed on Cypherum's YouTube channel, so hello to those of you watching us on there. Certificates of attendance are available upon request. To get yours, please send an email to nutrients.webinar@mdpi.com. Certificates will be delivered to those who have registered and are watching on Zoom, not on YouTube. Thank you for your understanding. There will be 3 presentations today of about 25 minutes each. The presentations are followed by a question time moderated by the chair. If you have any questions for our speakers, please post them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. Please remember to mention the name of the person to whom you're addressing your question. Today's webinar is chaired by Professor Dr. Luis Moreno. Luis Moreno is Professor of Public Health at the University of Zaragoza in Spain. He did his training as medical doctor and his PhD thesis at the University of Zaragoza. He studied human nutrition and public and community health at the University of Nancy in France. He has participated in several research projects supported by the Spanish Ministry of Health and the European Commission. He has published more than 700 papers in peer-reviewed journals. He is the coordinator of GENUD, Growth, Exercise, Nutrition and Development Research Group at the University of Zaragoza. He is a former member of the ESPGHAN Committee of Nutrition and former president of the Spanish Nutrition Society. Thank you, Luis, for chairing today's webinar. That's it from me. I now hand over the mic to Luis and I wish everyone a pleasant webinar.
Thank you, Charlotte. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. It is a pleasure for me to present this second nutrients webinar that is titled Dietary Patterns, Dietary Behavior in Children and Adolescents. And you can see there the photos of the speakers, and you will see also them in the screen. And this is about eating habits, dietary patterns, dietary behaviors, and we will by sure learn about the complex system of determinants that influence eating habits in children, and also what is more difficult, how to modify these behaviors, how to modify these eating habits. And for doing this, for addressing these topics, we have selected 3 speakers, very well known. I am going to introduce them. First, Dr. Antje Hebestreit. She is head of the unit Lifestyle-Related Disorders at the Leibniz Institute for Prevention, Research and Epidemiology, that is called BIPS. The acronym is BIPS in Bremen, Germany. After her PhD in nutritional sciences, she worked as postdoctoral research fellow at the Harvard School of Public Health and also as consultant for the UN World Food Programme. And then she joined the IDEFIX study in 2006 to coordinate the German branch of the survey and intervention. Over the years, she worked focusing on the studying the role of dietary intake, dietary behavior, and their determinants, as I was already mentioning, in the development of non-communicable diseases, as well primary prevention strategies for childhood obesity. The second speaker is Dr. Jess Haines. She is a dietitian and associate professor of applied nutrition at the University of Guelph in Canada. Her research aims try to bridge epidemiologic research on the determinants of health behaviors, again, with the design, implementation, and evaluation of intervention to support children's healthy eating and growth. Dr. Haines is the co-director of the Guelph Family Health Study, that is a longitudinally family-based cohort, and also she is the director of the Parent-Child Feeding Laboratory, which focuses on identifying how parent-child feeding interactions influence children's eating behavior. And finally, Professor Mai Chin A Paw is a researcher and chair at the University of the section Child and Adolescent Public Health at Amsterdam UMC. Her research focuses on determinants and health consequences of physical activity and sedentary behavior in youth, with a strong interest in underlying mechanisms and innovations in risk factor research. She is acknowledged for her innovations in methodology, including mediation analysis and participatory action methods in children. In addition, she has recently finished serving a 2-year term as president of the International Society of Behavioral Nutrition and Physical Activity, and she is currently part of multiple advisory committees for public health organizations and networks. Then we have our agenda. We did this brief introduction. We will have the presentations one after the other in this order, Dr. Hebestreit, then Dr. Haines and Professor Chin A Paw, and finally, considering the questions you will write in the chat, we will have the question and answers discussion. Thank you very much for your attention for this brief introduction, and we move to the heart, to the core of the webinar. So please, Antje, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Luis. Thank you. Welcome, everybody. So again, thank you very much for having me and for giving me the opportunity to give you some insights into the determinants of dietary patterns and dietary behaviors in children and adolescents. The main results I'm presenting here are based on the data from the EDIFIX and iFamily cohort. Briefly, the EDIFIX study started in 2006, and in 2007 we investigated more than 16,200 children across Europe in 8 European countries that you can see here, the green ones. And we examined a lot of dietary markers, but also physiological markers and environmental factors. And in 2 years later, after an intense intervention, we revisited those children and re-examined them. And by this time, they were 4 to 12 years. And even after another 4 years during the iFamily study, we were able to revisit these children again. Now they were between 8 and 16-year-olds, and investigated again dietary and lifestyle related disorders and risk factors for obesity. So as I said, most of the results I'm presenting here are based on the data from EDIFIX and iFamily cohort. To start with, hunger and satiation are inborn, but eating habits, food preferences, food choices, portion sizes, they are learned. And we wanted to know who or what plays a role in these associations. So first we wanted to know actually what do European children and adolescents eat and how do they eat? So we derived, in this case, 3 dietary patterns, and I want to share one with you that you understand how they were composed. So this is the sweet and fat dietary pattern, and you see this would be the mean intake of the population. And here you can see that those who are assigned to this dietary pattern, they have a higher than average intake from food groups like sugars and sweets, unhealthy oils, but also sweetened beverages like sodas, iced teas, energy drinks, and also sweetened milks are also consumed over average here. and also the energy coming from those food groups. So what was astonishing was that we found that the dietary patterns from parents were very similar to those of their children. We know this from investigations where parents are proxy reporters for the children, because parents then tend to report their own diet as the child's diet. But in this case, using the iFamily data, children were their own reporters because they were adolescents already. And so it was an unexpected finding that these patterns resembled each other so much. And you can see that also now in the other two dietary patterns. So we could see that children eat what their parents eat. Now we wanted to know if this is actually the case, or if this happens because of the high exposure. And we investigated the odds ratios for being assigned to these patterns together with the parents with increasing number of family meals. And we could see that if mothers and fathers eat, as an example, a sugar-rich diet, the child was twice as likely to be in the same dietary pattern. And this effect was stronger with the number of shared family meals. And then we wanted to know if sugar-sweetened beverages, as an example, if they were available during the family meals, if this had played a role in being assigned to the sweet and fat dietary pattern. And we could observe that if mother and father were drinking those sweetened beverages, then the child was also more likely to be in the sweet and fat pattern, because the children tend then also to eat and drink those foods, meaning that children have similar eating pattern compared to their parents when the exposure during family meals and the availability of foods at home does support this. So, but this can also be very protective. So we know that family meals are protective when it comes to a healthy diet, because parents create the food environments for children's early experiences, and they are gatekeepers for the foods in the family food environment. So the parents can influence the children's eating by their own eating behavior as role models, by their own taste preferences and food choices. So now we knew what was the role of the parents in developing dietary patterns or eating patterns. Now we wanted to know, what about the siblings? So we could see in another investigation using our data that the parent-offspring correlation was quite high. And we could see that that was strong for healthy foods, particularly when children were younger. And in particular, when we looked at the sibling correlation, so we could see that the resemblance between siblings was strong for healthy foods and for younger children, meaning that when children are at home, like the bottleneck for unhealthy foods, parents seem to restrict unhealthy foods at home. And this seems that also the older siblings may be protected by this. And now we wanted to know what is the difference between sibling and peers. So the next analysis was focusing on fast food eating between siblings and peers. And here you can see nicely that when you look at fast food consumption with increasing age, children tend to have this snacking behavior more and more with their peers, but less and less with their siblings. So it seems like when they were young, they have fast food rather with their siblings and later with the peers. And that was also quite similar also for screen time duration as an example, but very different for sports club participation. I thought you might be interested in also these behaviors. So this is different for eating behaviors compared to other behaviors. But now we looked into peers, and peers are defined in this analysis more like children in the same age, from the same environment, from the same school, same class, but we wanted to know, what about friends? What's the role of friends in the child's dietary patterns or dietary behaviors? And we have the beauty of having friends in our cohort as well, first, second, and third defined friends. So, and we looked into different variables associated also with high BMI or low BMI, and we found that children tend to choose friends who resemble their snacking behavior in terms of fast food frequency or sugar sweetened food snacking behavior, which was in our case expressed as propensity of sugary foods from our food frequency questionnaire. So here we could see that friends also play a role in the child's food choices, and it seems like snacking together is maybe also some kind of leisure time behavior. So now we know how social networks might shape a child's diet, but what about the socioeconomic background? This is another study starting during the baseline, and the study was observing three different dietary patterns, which were characterized having a lot of processed foods or a lot of sweet foods, or then a healthy food pattern. And then we investigated this again in the first follow-up after 2 years, and we observed the same dietary patterns again. And we found that those children who were still after 2 years in the same unhealthy pattern, they were mainly from a low socioeconomic background. But those children with, over the time, a healthy dietary pattern, they were more likely from a background with higher educated parents. So, and we could see that education and socioeconomic background also play a role in shaping the food choices in children. So when we look into sensory taste preferences, we investigated the results from preference tests with results from the food frequency questionnaire. And here we observed that those parents who really like fatty foods, they consumed twice as much fatty foods as those who did not like fatty foods. And we observed the same also with parents with a sweet tooth. They also consumed more sweet foods. But if we look here at the children, we see that there is a very small difference only. So this whole behavior, the children's food consumption seemed to be unaffected by their own preferences, indicating again that parents really seem to restrict unhealthy foods that are sweet and fat in the family environment and tend to eat them when the children are not around. So we know that parents' preference and parents also shape the child's diet, and they sometimes have the habit to add sugar to healthy foods in order to make them more appealing. So there's a habit of adding sugar to milk and fruits, and we investigated if this habit was associated also to obesity risk, which we could support, and also that children who do not have this habit, who only have a very low frequency of adding sugar to fruits and milks, they persistently showed healthier dietary profiles over a 2 years period. So, and this suggests that the habit of adding sugar to foods may impact the adherence to healthy dietary guidelines and dietary intakes over time. So better to start early to transport a diet and healthy dietary patterns. One thing that also happens during puberty is that the risk behavior increases in growing children and adolescents. And there is one factor, the impulsivity. which is also under observation, and the impulsive behavior is a coping strategy that we know that is used to lessen the intensity of negative emotions, meaning if the child or the adolescent is sad or angry or bored, then they have a higher tendency for comfort eating, to eat higher energy dense snacks and snack foods. And this is sometimes also coming together with media use. We know this behavior when children are bored or angry, that they try to cope these emotions with media time and comfort eating. So we also wanted to know what's the association, what's the role of commercial TV advertisement in association with the consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages. And here we observed that the longer children in this age group are exposed to commercial TV advertising, the higher is also their intake of sugar-sweetened beverages. And this is also happening regardless of whether parents discourage such drinks and if there are family rules against these sugar-sweetened beverages. So we can see that the media influence is stronger than the parental rules. So, but this was TV and commercial TV, so we wanted to know, is it only the food-related commercials, or is it screen time per se that also influences dietary intake? So, and then we investigated in our family data whether the preference for particular tastes was different in children with short or longer screen behaviors. And here we investigated TV use, PC, smartphone, and internet use. And we observed that those children, adolescents with a prolonged digital media exposure, they had an increased preference for sweet, fatty, and salting tasting foods, we know as ultra-processed foods or snack foods. And they had a decreased preference for the bitter tasting foods. And we know that these bitter tasting foods are more related to healthier foods. So last, I would like to introduce you to a systematic literature review we conducted. This was done by my PhD student, Elida Sina. We wanted to know what about the social media use in the role of children, shaping children's dietary preferences. And the studies we extracted, they showed a dose-response relationship between social media influencer marketing and the intake frequency of sugar-sweetened beverages and those with high caffeine intake content, also unhealthy snack foods, fast food consumption frequency, but also breakfast skipping. Unfortunately, there was no evidence that influencer marketing could also influence healthy food intake. So the mechanisms discussed here, it seems that social media influencer that adolescents trust them more because they are sometimes of the same age group, and they seem to be more trustworthy than maybe celebrities, and this enhances the advertising effect. The problem is that the devices used for social media interaction or to go to these platforms are more and more out of parental control because the devices are so easy to transport. And this means also that, that there is a higher potential to increase the children's attention span to these commercials. So to conclude, we know now that parents are gatekeepers for unhealthy or healthy foods at home, and parents act as role models during family meals, but they also set rules. Still, the role of social media and influencers and their advertisement seems stronger than the rules at home. We know that peers and friends, the social environments, the social networks, share unhealthy snacking patterns that increases also with age. So it is better to shape healthy eating habits early in life that once the children choose their friends and peers, that then the healthy habits are already in place. We know that siblings are only helpful when they are young, meaning that if I have as a child a younger sibling, then parents might restrict unhealthy foods more and in the food home environment, and this is why my exposure then is maybe less. And we know that education and food literacy are key to improve healthy dietary patterns and behaviors in this age group. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was lovely. And a good start to sort of understand sort of some of those key influences on children and adolescents' health. So I just want to start just thanking Nutrients for this opportunity to present today. I have followed Dr. Hebestreit and Chin A Paw's research for a long time, so I feel really privileged to be on this panel with them. It was also nice to have the opportunity to reflect and think about this subject of family food literacy. So our team has been doing research on developing and testing interventions to improve family food literacy, and we define families as parents and their children. And so today I thought I would share a bit about what we're thinking, some of our struggles as we think about defining, like, what is family food literacy, what measures should we be using for family food literacy, and importantly, what strategies have been done to improve food literacy, but what should we do about sort of next steps? So my goal today is that for those of you watching today who are interested in this topic, we have a bit of a roadmap about what we should do next to sort of move this field of family food literacy forward. So thinking first about definition of food literacy. So there's no universal definition of food literacy out there, but one that's used quite often is that by Dr. Helen Vidkin and Danielle Gallegos. These are Australian researchers that have done great work to define food literacy, and they define it as interrelated factors that are needed to plan, manage, select, prepare, and eat foods that can meet our dietary needs. Now, many of these factors sound quite individual. So these are individual factors that you need to learn in order to meet your dietary needs. But in their 2014 article, they also acknowledge that there's the environment, the food environment, that's really important. So they also define this food literacy as is a set of skills that sort of scaffold and empower individuals, households, communities, or nations to try and change and strengthen dietary resilience over time. So acknowledging that environmental factors are really important as well. So Dr. Joyce Slater, who's at the University of Manitoba in my own country here in Canada, built on this and thought about the importance of various levels of food literacy. Now, she built this work on that of Dr. Nutbeam's work, and Dr. Nutbeam has done some excellent work to think about how to define health literacy. And his work suggested that instead of just focusing on individual level factors that allow us to, say, interpret and apply health information, there's also structural barriers that need to be considered. Now, Dr. Joyce Slater used this work and thought about it applying to food literacy. So in her work, she's defined these three types or levels of food literacy. So we have functional food literacy, and this is the knowledge and skills that allow us to select and eat healthy foods. But she also acknowledged that there's interactive food literacy, and this is the idea that both our cultural and social aspects of food influence our intake. So Antje's work certainly suggests this, right? This idea that social, your peers, your family also influence food. So we need to understand that as well. And then she moved a next step to explore thinking about critical food literacy. And this is, we need to understand our food, where our food comes from, where our food system, how our food systems are structured, in order for us to be able to advocate for change and the importance of changing that food environment in order to support healthy eating. So Dr. Joyce Slater's work she also did a series of a Delphi process with a number of experts, and these experts also included youth themselves, so culinary arts students and nutrition students, to try and figure out, using this framework of these various levels of food literacy, how do we define food literacy specifically for youth? What are the aspects that are particularly important for this life stage of late adolescence, sort of early adulthood? So within functional, they talked about sort of the knowledge and skills that would be needed to sort of select and prepare foods. But the important piece about the interactive, and again, building on Antje's work, this idea that we need to understand the peer influence and how this sort of enjoyment of food and sharing of food with peers, etc., can influence their level of food literacy and their selection of healthy food choices. Importantly, thinking about the critical food literacy that youth needed and wanted to understand issues of equity and sustainability within the food system, so that they could advocate and change some of these aspects of food in the food environment. So our team is really intrigued in this work and the importance of thinking of these various levels of food literacy, but also this idea of how do we create a definition of food literacy that's relevant for particular life stages. So when we think about family food literacy and think about parents in particular, that their definition of food literacy and the competencies that we want parents to develop likely look different than adults who are not parents or children, for example. So some things we're thinking about that might be important when we think about these types of food literacy and parents in particular, that when we think about some of the knowledge we want them to know, that functional competencies, some of that's going to be, what are the nutritional requirements of their children? What do they need to thrive? What sort of portion sizes are appropriate for kids? That type of knowledge specific to their kids. When we think about interactive, they, of course, just as Antje's presentation identified, are critical, especially with young kids, about the type of food environment they have, but also the types of feeding practices they do with their children. What kind of modeling do they do? What kind of rules do they have within their home around food? And so being thoughtful about not just general social interactions, but the importance of thinking about, what do parents know about their particular parenting practices and how do they implement them? And then we thought, when we think about critical food literacy, here we're thinking a lot about the fact that not only do they need sort of environments generally, but parents may want to be knowledgeable about how the food environments where their children spend their time, so things like schools, recreation centers, etc., how that's influencing their children's intake, and do they want to do advocacy around that to change those kind of environments? And if they know that knowledge, will it increase that kind of advocacy? So that's been some of our thinking about parents' food literacy. And then also with children. So a lot of Joyce Slater's work was with older adolescents and young adults. So many of the things we think are important skills look the same, I think, as some of those youth and older young adults. But what we're really interested in is, what's the level of knowledge that different children need to know at different ages? So what's sort of, how do we adapt this when we're thinking about different age groups within these children? So that's giving us some thought as well. So thinking about next steps when we think about definitions, I think a universal definition of food literacy specific to these key life stages will inform some of our measurement going forward, as well as some of our interventions with improving family food literacy. So now to think a bit about measurement of food literacy. How do we do that? What's out there that measures parent and kids' food literacy, and sort of what do we know for next steps? So there was a team in Australia that has done some, I think it was Helen Vidgen's team did some of this work to do a scoping review to identify what food literacy measures exist for adults. Their review identified 12 different tools. Interestingly, most were published in the previous 3 years from the review, which was published in 2019. So suggesting this is really an emerging field. A lot of interest is happening right now. These tools were developed and tested in various countries. And interestingly, so they used their own definition of food literacy to see how many of these measures assessed all 4 domains that the Wittgen and Gallagher's food literacy definition identified. And half of them did that. So fairly comprehensive. But importantly, for the work that I just talked about defining parent food literacy, only 1 assessed any level of critical food literacy. And none of these existing tools assessed parents' knowledge and use of some of those healthful food parenting practices we would want to do. So I think there's some room for improvement to think about when we're thinking specifically about family food literacy, what kind of measure do we want? Interestingly, thinking about the lack of critical food literacy measured, Dr. Diane Park, who's a Korean researcher, has developed and was very recently published in Nutrients, a tool that was designed to assess critical food literacy, to incorporate that critical food literacy piece in the assessment. So they tried to add a food systems dimension, or they did add, that thought about not only thought about those categories of the Wittgen and Gallagher's definition of food literacy, but added a component to think about food literacy. Think about food systems. So what is their knowledge about production and sustainable production of foods, for example? And they've done a tested the construct validity and reliability among 200 Korean adults. So certainly some move forward in this area. Now, thinking about measurement of food literacy in children and adolescents, our team, so a master's student and a postdoctoral student that I get to work with, has led this work, and it's currently under review. And they identified 12 tools that most were published from 2012 to 2021. So again, a fairly emerging field. Again, they were done in 7 regions within within the world, none actually in Canada. There was only 1 tool for preschoolers. So the vast majority of existing tools measure for school age and adolescents. Importantly, none assessed any of that interactive food literacy. So none of that enjoyment of food. Sorry, I'm at my mother-in-law's and apparently she's doing some renovations. So I apologize if you can hear some of that in the background. So none of them assessed interactive food literacy. So that social enjoyment of foods and peer influence. And only 2 assessed critical food literacy. So something to think about moving forward. So on this screen, I have these next 2 slides sort of summarize some of the psychometric properties of the existing tools. So to orient you around these next 2 slides, the column on your left identifies the tool name, the author and year, and the country where this research was done. In the center 3 columns, what we're identifying with the checks and the X's are the types of validity testing that these different tools underwent. And that last column on the right is identifying the outcome of the work to look at reliability of these tools. As you can see, this first slide, you can see most of the 6 of the 12 tools have actually been tested since 2020. So definitely emerging, a very new field as we think about measurement of food literacy in kids. 9 of the 12 tools actually did undergo some content validity with experts who identified whether or not key constructs were measured. 6 of the 12, or 50% of them, actually went through some face validity with kids to actually see, do they seem to be measuring what they are hoping to? And then 10 of the 12 did some level of construct validity. So the measures of construct validity seem fairly strong as well. And so here's the second slide identifying some of the earlier work. And I would say some of the earlier work did not have as detailed psychometrics measures. So we're certainly making some progress to do better work with our more recent tools. So in summary, most of the tools were found to be valid and reliable for these children and adolescents for specific age and ethnic groups and cultural regions. We know that the food context looks different in different spaces, so some cross-cultural adaptations are likely needed, or cross-context adaptations are likely needed of these tools. There was very limited assessment of both interactive and critical aspects of food literacy. Some could certainly move the field forward there somewhat. And as we were reflecting on the various tools, we acknowledged that, back to my first point, a universal definition of food literacy for these specific ages could really support the development of tools. If we knew exactly what is it we need kids to know at these various ages, would really help that sort of development of the tools. So when we think about next steps for measurement, I think identifying valid, reliable, and context or culturally specific measures of food literacy that assess both this functional, interactive, and critical food literacy of both adults who are parents, as well as kids, would really move the field forward as we thought about family food literacy. And lastly, thinking about strategies to support food literacy. So to assess this, I worked with an undergraduate student over the past few weeks just to get a sense of what existing interventions are out there that are trying to change both parent food literacy and children's food literacy. And in that review, we identified 12 studies published from 2014 to 2021. The vast majority of this intervention work had been done in the US, others done in Australia, Scotland, as well as Sri Lanka. Interestingly, when we looked at the various strategies that these programs did, all of them included some sort of nutrition education as well as a cooking component. The vast majority of them did that work in a group setting. So they brought the families together and they did a group-based class. So it's interesting, it was fairly universal, the approach. There was one study in the US that actually, as part of a home visiting program, did some food preparation with families in their home. 6 out of 12 did address food parenting, but in a very minor way, meaning they would talk about modeling or picky eating at sort of one of the nutrition education sessions. Now, as Antje's work showed, modeling is really important, but again, there's other aspects of food parenting, I would argue, that could be included in these food-based interventions. None addressed critical food literacy. So there was no talk about understanding and advocating for change within the food system. Now, these are tables that outline the studies that we were able to find that tried to address both parent and child food literacy. Like my previous table, I have identified the author, year, and location of the work, the age of the children, as well as the sample size, and I'll talk about that in just a sec. We included a check mark to identify whether or not they addressed food parent. The result, we actually see a change in the children's or parents' food literacy or in the diet of the kids. As you'll see when you're taking a look at the sample size of the interventions, a large majority of these studies are small pilots that were just testing out the feasibility primarily. They often measured some of the changes in food literacy or fruit and vegetable intake as a pre-post design, but certainly we did not have very many large-scale randomized trials to really identify how family food literacy can be changed. And here are a few more. Number of them, again, published fairly recently, so from 2020 to 2021, which again suggests that there's lots of room to move this field forward. And these last ones. So certainly, again, you'll see some of the samples are quite small, so some room for improvement. And in thinking about the inclusion of food parenting, there's additional research that suggests this will be important in our interventions. So Dr. Jennifer Targaglia, I hope is the way I pronounce her name, she's an Australian researcher that did focus groups with 67 parents to identify what needs existed when they thought about parent food literacy, and what they found through these interviews was that definitely a piece of when we think about parent food literacy and are trying to intervene and address these nutrition education to improve food literacy through these nutrition education programs, that yes, food literacy was important, so some of those skills and knowledge, but many of the parents talked about the importance and challenges of food parenting, so that their summary or of their findings was that absolutely these interventions need to address food literacy, but must also focus on strengthening parenting practices. So a real important support that from our work, looking at what interventions are there, this qualitative work also supports the idea of engaging and addressing parenting practices. So when we think about next steps for this intervention work, I think we need to develop and test family food literacy interventions that incorporate this food parenting as well as critical food literacy. I think the other thing that could happen here, as we looked at the types of intervention strategies that folks were doing, the vast majority were some sort of education and some sort of cooking class. And I think we could start thinking about getting a little creative. Is there other ways that we can engage families? Because it takes a fair bit for families to like organize their family well enough, get to a community center, engage in an evening of cooking. I think there's lots to be said for it. It's lots of engagement, but I think as interventionists, we could start thinking, is there other creative ways that we can engage families? We did a program over COVID called Weeknight Supper Savers, and there we were trying to increase family food literacy, to improve dietary intake, but also to reduce food waste. And because of COVID, we had to do the class online. And so engaged families sort of where they actually do their cooking. And I think getting creative about, is that a way we can reach more people? They don't have to leave their home. They're actually doing it within their home. Might be some, I think there's room for creativity as we think about approaches for these family food literacy interventions. So I'm just going to summarize by, as we're thinking about this field of family food literacy, here's the critical next steps I think that need to happen when we think about definition, measurement, and intervention. So first, as I said, we need to create universal definitions of food literacy that are specific to those exact life stages. What do we want to know? What do we want when we think about parent food literacy? What are the critical aspects? And I think there's work to be done there to define that, and likely for younger, and likewise for younger kids. I also think we want to identify valid, reliable, context and culturally specific measures of food literacy. And I think many of the existing measures certainly do measure things like food knowledge and food skills, but we certainly don't have as much of that interactive and critical food literacy that I think could be added to the field and to these measures. And lastly, importantly, thinking about developing and testing family food literacy interventions, and that I think need to talk about food parenting. That's the stuff parents need, the skill set they need to help some of that interactive food parenting or interactive food literacy. And importantly, thinking about how do we think about empowering these families to make change in their food environments when thinking about critical food literacy. So thank you so much for listening, and I'll look forward to some discussions at the end. Here's how you can find me. And this picture is my favorite two food literacy students. These are my kids canning some tomatoes. So looking forward to chatting.
Thank you, Jess. Now we can move on to Mai.
Okay, good afternoon or evening or morning, everyone. For me, it's also a pleasure to be here. And so thank you for inviting me. And I'm happy to talk about my experiences about co-creating interventions to improve energy balance behaviors together with children. In most public health research, the target group participates as respondents in research, and sometimes we also ask their opinion, but they seldom have a decisive power. And so to that end, at the end of the day, the researchers profit more from the study than the participants. Moreover, many previous interventions aimed at promoting healthy energy balance related behaviors showed limited effectiveness, especially on the long term and among disadvantaged populations. So this means that many interventions even increase health inequalities rather than reduce them. And in theory, these mainly top-down designed and implemented interventions make perfect sense, but in practice, things go differently. For instance, interventions are not implemented the way they are supposed to be, or they don't reach the groups that need them the most. So yeah, that's the reason why we switched to participatory research. And since participatory research and co-creation are terms that are increasingly being used, I would like to start with explaining what my or our definition is. Because there are different ways of participation as a research method, so that participants are involved in the health research in specific ways in order to improve the quality of the research. And a level higher is participation as a research paradigm, which means that participation is really the defining principle throughout the whole research process. And an example of participation as a research paradigm is participatory action research. And essential in this type of research is the active involvement of participants, and the collaboration between participants and researchers is equal. So the decision making is shared. It's a process of mutual learning. So participants can learn basic research skills, while researchers learn a lot from the participants and the situation of the participants. So they generally participants work with a facilitator. Together they identify the problem, or identify which research methods to use, collect data together, also analyze the data, and also present the data together. And the lived experience of the participants is the most important basis for knowledge. The second word in participatory action research, action, is as important as participation. So action is part of the research. Action is the process of learning. So by taking action, observing what happens and reflecting, you gain knowledge, and based on then you adapt maybe your plan or revise your plan or start in a new direction. So action is essential part of the research. So you could define participatory action research as research that aims to improve the health and reduce health inequities through involving the people who it all matters, who in turn take actions to improve their own health. So rather than policymakers or health promoters or researchers coming up with interventions, the interventions are really developed and implemented and evaluated together with those that they are aimed to help. So there are different levels of participation, and you could see that as a participation ladder is an example of how it's often explained. It's different levels of participation. It doesn't mean that one is better than the other. It's just at a different level. So for one research, a lower rank might be more preferable than for other types of research. Well, the lower rungs of the ladder are actually non-participation. Manipulation, it also doesn't sound too nice. It happens when adults use young people to support causes and pretend that these causes are inspired by the young people, but in real life, they are not. So for instance, an example is that adults collect drawings from children about, for instance, healthy foods, and then they come up with, this is what children want, but in reality, it's not the case. The second rank, decoration, happens when young people are used to help or bolster a cause in a relatively indirect way. So, but here adults do not pretend that the cause is inspired by young people. And then we have tokenism, which is also not a good way. So that's why it's non-participation. It's when young people appear to be given a voice, but in fact, they have little or no choice at all about what they do or how they participate. So it's kind of, they are, it's like, it's pretended that children have a voice, but in reality, they do not. Then at a higher level of the ladder, you have is when young people are assigned a specific role and informed about how and why they are being involved. So they are taking seriously. And consulted and informed happens when young people also give advice on projects or program designs, but these are run by adults. So the young people are informed about how their input will be used and also about the outcomes of the decisions, but they don't take the decisions themselves. So an example is, for instance, a youth advisory council. And then at the highest ranks, we have first adult-initiated research, but with shared decisions with young people. So projects or programs are initiated by adults, which is often the case because, it's rare that you get funding and you don't have strict regulations about the aim or the deliverables you have to provide. So the project is initiated by adults, but the decision making is shared with the young people. So this participatory action research together with youth is an example of this level. Then we have young people initiated and directed projects. So young people initiate and direct the project themselves, and they can maybe ask adults to support them or advise them. And then at the highest rank is young people initiated, but shared decisions with adults. And you might think, why is that above the young people initiated and directed? It's because in these projects, young people are empowered while at the same time enabled by adults to learn from the lived experience and expertise of adults. So here the youth initiated, but adults see them as equals and collaborate with them. The title of my lecture was co-creation, and I see co-creation as a branch of participatory action research, and it's relatively new in public health research, and there are no frameworks or protocols how to conduct co-creation for public health. So that's why we initiated the Health Cascade project. It's a European project. You see the link to the website, so very welcome to visit. We just started this year. And it's important to define what you mean by co-creation. So we started with a definition, and our definition of evidence-based co-creation that it's aimed at developing, implementing, and evaluating health promotion innovations together with multiple stakeholders, the public, academia, civil organizations, industries, by means of collaborative research and shared decision-making throughout the entire process. So this was a bit of a background. What are we talking about? What do I mean by co-creation or participatory research? And I'm happy to share some research we have done on different ranks of the ladder. I start with a research where we worked together with children as experts. So we consulted children and took them very seriously. And an example of this research is the project where we examined children and parent perceived determinants of sedentary behavior. And we used the concept mapping method for that. And that's a mixed method study where you start in small groups with children and parents. We also did it with parents, but for the sake of time, I only present the children's data. So children start first with individually brainstorming about all the ideas or reason why they sit or engage in sedentary behavior or their peers. And then they share one by one these ideas. And if all the ideas are collected, they are sorted based on how they fit together and also rated on importance. And then they are quantitatively analyzed using concept mapping software. So you can see clusters of motives for engaging in sedentary behavior. And the most important reasons for this, according to the children, was that children sit because they have to. It is the norm. Our society is very designed for sitting, schools, public spaces. So children hear a lot, you have to sit. But they also mentioned I can work better that way, or there's nobody to play with. So most of the reasons, the determinants they raised were environmental, not that they like that sitting very much. And then we also did participatory action research, where we worked together with the children as co-researchers. A first example is a participatory research where we explored Dutch primary school children's perspectives of activity-friendly school playgrounds. So this is a participatory study without the action. And here children at 3 primary schools, small groups of children collaborated together with one of my colleagues, conducting research on their own school playgrounds. They chose the different research methods they used, collected the data, analyzed the data, and also chose how to present the data. And they all chose to present it to a mixed audience at all 3 schools. The director and their peers were in the audience. And in one of the schools, also the architect of the school. And the results of this study were that safety regulations were very limiting in their physical activity behavior. And children mentioned, we don't mind to fall as long, just give us a Band-Aid, but don't limit us in our physical activity behavior. Other aspects that were, that playgrounds were boring, not well kept, broken benches, dirty, lack of variety of equipment, or even if you have a very fancy playground, if you are in the same school for 8 years, it becomes boring. And also space available for free play. And yeah, so playgrounds should be more fun, is also what children mentions. And one of the nice quotes we heard from children is that adults come up with really boring ideas. So that's another reason why they should be involved in research that concerns them. Then participatory action research conducted by my colleague Manu Anselma, which you see a picture in the right, and her publications here below. It was a participatory action research in a disadvantaged neighborhood in Amsterdam. The aim of this project was to reduce health inequalities in a disadvantaged neighborhood in Amsterdam with children as co-researchers. And the project started in April 2016 and ended in September 2019. You see here it was a long, intensive project. Here you see it started with a thorough needs assessment, creating partnerships in the neighborhood, the formation of action teams, which means that the research teams with the children, action development, implementation and evaluation of the different actions, and also a gradual transfer of the responsibilities to the neighborhoods, so that you, not when you leave as researcher, everything goes back to normal, but that's the action teams remain to exist. So continuous activities throughout these years were the action team meetings, weekly action at 4 schools, capacity building for the children in the action teams to conduct the research, implement and evaluate the actions. And the children involved family and community members wherever they needed, and a thorough process evaluation was part of the study. And you might recognize some terms from intervention mapping. Here we combined intervention mapping with youth-led participatory action research. Some results were that sports activity, there was a need for more variety, continuous, affordable and accessible sports activities. A safe environment, safety was very important in this neighborhood. A playground is, and what is meant by a playground is it's a designated area to play with different zones, supervision, different materials and activities are organized there. And parent and community involvement was also mentioned, as well as an integral approach as very important. Some examples of actions was at one of the schools, they started with a policy that they could only drink water at school because the children identified that many children drank sugar drinks at school. And they also noticed that at other schools in Amsterdam, there was already a water policy. And you might think, well, the water policy, it's not that innovative, but in other schools, there was quite some problematic implementation with the water policy because it was implemented top down. And here the children themselves came up with the idea. So it was a much smoother implementation. And here you can see that drinking water, so the healthy choice, can become the norm. Cooking workshops were organized. Children said that more education was needed how to prepare healthy foods, but they said it needs to be fun and practical, such as cooking workshops. Children also wanted more after-school activities because of the financial, logistic and safety problems. Not all children had the opportunity to join to a sports club or travel to a sports club. So children and parents were very happy with after-school activities. And based on that previous point, there was an Olympic tournament organized for the 4 primary schools. So they all trained for that tournament and then battled each other during the big day. And all children also wanted to make a movie in which they could show other children how bad sugar is for you. And it works much better if your peers explain that to you compared to, for instance, boring adults. Another example of a participatory action research is the LIKE program, in which we combine the systems dynamics with participatory action research. The LIKE project stands for Lifestyle Innovations Based on Youth's Knowledge and Experience. It's a project where we worked together with 10 to 14-year-old youth, so in the transition from primary to secondary school in the Netherlands. Yeah, we also explored different settings, the family settings, the school setting, the neighborhood and the city. And also here we had action teams, 2 at primary schools and 2 at secondary schools, where we worked throughout the years, every week with the children, conducting research, coming up with actions, implementing and evaluating them. And here we did that on the background of the system dynamics. So we built actual causal loop diagrams with the children to get a picture of the system and how to improve the system or disrupt the system. One of the examples of the dietary behavior, the health team that focusing on dietary behavior. And well, it's as soon as you go to secondary school in Amsterdam, I don't know how it is in other countries, is that youth go to the supermarket during the break to buy cheap and unhealthy snacks and sugary drinks. Other things that they mentioned as important things was the liking. They like the taste of the snacks and the sugary drinks. It's widely available and cheap. It's the walking distance to the supermarkets is very small, and there's limited of healthy, especially nice healthy food options in the canteens. So this project is still in action, and we really try to disrupt the unhealthy food system in this project. But what we noticed was that when doing participatory research on healthy dietary behavior, there are some challenges. Children have lots of good ideas, but they don't want to be the bad cop. So they don't want to tell their peers that it's not allowed to eat candy anymore at school. And also they deep inside, they really don't want these regulations at school. So they much more like to come up with actions in the physical activity fields rather than healthy foods. So that's a challenge. Well, our experience with participatory research with youth is that it has many, many advantages. It increases the empowerment of the children, the youth, and thereby making it also a sustainable approach, increases their feelings of participant ownership of the actions. It gives really new, novel, important insights in the world of youth. So yeah, it increases the likelihood that the resulting actions really meets the needs of youth and is appropriate for the context. Yeah, so many advantages, but also some challenges. It's noticed the time frame. It takes a lot of time, weekly meetings with different action groups, and also it takes time to build trusting relationships with the children, to be able to work with them in equality. It needs training, capacity building. Of course, they are not trained to be researchers. A good organizational structure, good, strong administrative support and adequate resources, because if they come up with really good ideas for actions, it's unethical if you cannot make them come true. So we really closely collaborate with the city. And you really need really good, skilled and flexible facilitators. You saw Elsje Caro in the picture and Manu Anselma, and also Helga Emke in the Light project. You need really strong facilitation skills to work with youth, and also a strong relationship with community stakeholders. To sum up, from our experience, youth participatory action research is very promising for public health. Youth are experts of their own life, so they are really needed if you want to improve their lives. And well, adults come up with really boring ideas. So if you need more creative ideas, you need the youth in your research. Thank you for your attention. And also I would like to thank my fantastic research team for all their inspiration and fantastic work. Thank you very much.
Thank you to all the three speakers. We only have 1 or 2 questions in the chat. But for the moment, we are going to follow the order of the presentations to raise some, let's say, specific questions, and then maybe at the end a general debate. First, it was the presentation by Dr. Hebestreit. Is there any question now from the audience or from the other speakers? If not, I have some questions. For example, one of the statements you did, or based, of course, in results from your studies, is that children food consumption seems unaffected by their own preferences. But this is at the age of childhood. I don't remember in which specific age group this study was performed. And also I would like to know when this changed during development, because I suppose this will change in the transition period from childhood to adolescence, or early adolescence, late adolescence, and maybe to identify the best time window, not to try to adapt the behaviors of the children.
Very important question. Actually, when I was drafting the slide, I was also checking again which data set it was, and it was indeed, it was from their family study. That means they have been 8 to 16-year-old. So still in that age, children and adolescents depend to a large extent on what is available at home. They might go out and have, maybe with their pocket money, they might buy snack foods with their friends, because we have seen that they tend to snack with their friends. But the main dietary intake still happens in the family food and environment with the family, and so that they depend on a large extent on what kind of foods are still at home. But we know also from studies, I think it was from the UK, that if families buy or tend to buy more out-of-home foods or foods from outlets, then also the food environment is unhealthy, so to say, and then they tend to eat more unhealthy snacks also in the food environment. So that's also seen in studies from families in lower socioeconomic lower socioeconomic households. And then you were asking about when it's the best time to, yeah, we have seen actually when we look into our trajectories, and we really, I mean, we have now the data from 2 years until they are young adults. And when we use the beauty of this large data set, we can see that the earlier you start in kindergarten at best, then the easiest it is to maintain a healthy diet over time. So the earlier we start, and we start with the family, with the siblings and the parents, the easier it is to really maintain that over time.
Thank you. And another interesting idea you raise is related with the influence of the media, and especially the social media. And in relation with your systematic review, which social media were included? Was there a differential effect of one or the other?
We used, so we looked into social media platforms in the first place. YouTube and these kind of platforms where influencers share, let's say, pictures of unhealthy foods or healthy foods. And if children watch these videos or see these pictures, and they tend to, then these pictures, we also looked into brain images. There were studies who also looked into how my memory system still has these pictures or these brand names still in the memory system. And later on, even if time goes by, when they have a say in the buying decisions later on, they tend to buy those foods. And then still the rewarding system is still responding to these brands.
I understand also that there is two kinds of potential effects. One is the effect of children using the social media, let's say during the day, dependently of the meals. But another one is the effect of media in general, and also social media during meal occasions. Did you check for this, or?
No, because in the Edifixer family studies, we did not really focus on simultaneous behaviors. At least we did not really distinguish between watching while eating or watching first and eating then. But thanks for this hint, might be a good idea to look into that.
And I would say there are some studies focusing on the use of the media during the meal occasions, but in general are with small samples and maybe in literature that we don't use to check. So maybe we should in the future at least be more aware of what people working more on behavior or physiology even are doing.
I know that the Guelph family studies, you have a lot of data during family meals when they watch movies on tablets or something. I know that when we were talking about your data and we looked into the famous study on mealtime video taking, that you have, I think it's not really, so during Edifixer family, I think it was not such a common behavior in Europe, but I think in Canada it still is, right, Jess?
Yes, we did measure whether or not kids use the screens, and also, Antje, you'll find this interesting, whether parents do, right? Do parents use their cell phones at the meal? And those kids whose parents use it, and the kids, if it's sort of allowed during screen time, they had higher screen time. And we haven't looked at it, but other studies have found that when that happens, the kids have lower dietary intake too. Right. And but I think there's interesting things to figure out what the exact mechanism is. Yeah. Is it that you're, sort of, do you respect food less generally? And so there's a little bit of is it an earlier predictor, or is it actually that screen time is causing you, to maybe eat a bit more mindlessly, not stay present to what's eating? So I think there's interesting mechanism studies that could be done.
Yeah, I think mindless eating is really a good keyword for this kind of behavior.
So if you eat with your screen, but there are only healthy foods on the table, that might maybe also
it's a good strategy. Nudging.
Mindless, you eat all the veggies.
Yeah, it's a way to get the kids to eat their veggies. Yeah. Just do it. Yeah.
It's boring, I would say. Okay, any other question for Antje? So maybe we will come back later. So we move to the presentation of Jess, and here we have a question that is very precise by Tuyen Duong, one of the attendees. What are the similarities and differences among food literacy, nutrition literacy, and healthy diet literacy? Are there any overlaps? Can we use one as proxy measure for another?
Yeah, all of those literacies are related in that we're trying to take a look at what people's understanding and skills related to those various aspects. So health is looking specifically at how well are you able to interpret health information and then use it in your life. Nutrition literacy is looking very defined at nutrition, right? So are you able to understand nutrient requirements, nutrition labels, and sort of use those to make good food choices? And food's a bit broader because it's thinking a bit more about some of those food skills. So getting a bit broader, often incorporating some of that nutrition literacy within that food literacy. Absolutely, I think you're going to find, and research has shown that those are quite correlated. So if you have higher health literacy, your food literacy is often higher. Whether or not you can use them as proxies will really depend on the question you are asking. If you're trying to get an overall sense of how sort of health literate or folks are, my guess is, as I said, they are going to be quite correlated. So maybe if you have a good measure of health literacy, you don't need a specific measure of food literacy. Whereas if you are trying to look at particularly diet outcomes or food outcomes, I think you're going to want to pick a measure of food literacy that's more specific, even though it's correlated to health literacy. Getting at the different aspects or the different competencies within food literacy is going to be more informative, I think, than a general measure of health literacy. I also think that we're just doing a study right now where we're trying to validate a measure of food literacy, and we have a measure of health literacy on our survey to explore exactly that, what kind of correlation happens. So I think if you're anyone on the call is thinking about developing measures, I think that could be a good construct validity measure, is how well those are correlated. But depending on your research question, I think you're going to want to get specific about the type of measure you want to use.
Any question from the panel? Yes, I have one or two. You mentioned that in general, one of the components of the food literacy is the critical awareness of food systems in general. But this is included in all the assessment tools and all the interventions you mentioned, or just in some?
Yeah, in fact, Luis, that's a real gap. So despite the fact that I think some of the more comprehensive definitions of food literacy are thinking about that critical piece, and I think when we think about a long-term goal of creating food environments that support healthy eating, I think that critical food literacy is going to be really important. But it is not well measured in our food literacy measures, both for adults or for kids, and it's not well addressed in our interventions. Now, these are food literacy interventions. I think what will be interesting is to look at in the field of sort of sustainable eating or food systems, like likely in fields like geography, et cetera. It'll be interesting to see when we think about sustainability, is there some information there about how to talk about food systems well and share information and enhance that critical food literacy. But right now, if we're looking just at those interventions that are state that they're trying to improve both parents and kids' food literacy, that critical piece of food literacy does not seem to be addressed. And I think that's a real gap that all of us should think about, what kind of intervention will be effective for that? And then what's the impact on their own dietary behaviors and on changing the food environment if they have that critical food literacy?
So I deduce, and this was another question, that there is very little information on the impact of these kind of interventions on different aspects of the food system. And for me, it is difficult to imagine which, let's say, variables or indicators of the food system we could address with these interventions. Do you have any idea?
Yeah, great question. And I say it's a great question because I probably don't have a great answer. Because I think you're right. I think that's a really important knowledge gap. I think there's a lot of interest in thinking about how do we support people in influencing their food system and the food environment, but do we know directly how to do that? I think Mai's work helps us think about that, right? Like they started to influence, the youth started to influence the food environment they have. So learning from there, but then also thinking about, as you said, what are the low-hanging fruit? What can we change when we think about the food system? And what does that look like? I think we have a lot of work to know what kind of those interventions strategies would be most effective. And I would say expanding our vision to think about what else has been done, again, in other fields like agriculture will help, or agriculture, geography, those sort of things. We'll get a better sense of what kind of strategies might be helpful to do that. So that's not a very satisfying answer, unfortunately, except to say lots of research is needed.
So we have a lot of work in front of us. Okay, another very interesting topic for me, at least, is the food parenting. And here again, I suppose it is not easy to improve the food parenting of the families. Which are the best strategies in your experience?
Yeah, great question. Cheryl Hughes has done good work to improve positive food parenting. So looking at her research will certainly give us some ideas. Emma Haycraft's work, thinking about the child feeding guide and giving parents tools and strategies to improve that positive food parenting we want to see. So I think some of my favorite work, say by Emma, has to do with sort of things about like how to get kids to try new foods. And her work shows that just getting kids to try it, making sure you model it, but you don't just model it as a parent, you also talk about how good it tastes. You know, you really emphasize like, wow, these carrots are delicious, the kids will be more likely to try it. And then of course, having it available quite often. I think we actually know a fair bit about how to support positive food parenting. It's just interesting that we haven't brought that together with our food literacy work to again think about if we want parents not only to prepare healthy meals for their kids and teach their kids how to prepare healthy foods, but also support healthy eating in their children, that food parenting needs to be a piece of it. So taking that great work that's been done by Cheryl Hughes and Emma Haycraft and others and bringing that together with food literacy, I think will move the field forward.
Any other question for Jess? If not, we move to the third presentation by Mai. And I think there is one question in the chat that can be a good one for you. A question by Tuyen Duong. The single and combinative effects of food and physical activity and screen time on children's health. Any comment or any direction?
Yeah, very good question. Maybe you remember the causal loop diagrams slide I showed. That were actually causal loop diagrams of the different behaviors, and we see that they are interconnected. Especially screen time is a very strong. It replaces physical activity, so it's directly linked to physical activity. It's also related to unhealthy snacking, also because of the advertising and the food marketing around screen shows or games or whatever. And also for sleep. I didn't talk about sleep, but that was the fourth behavior in the like projects that children examined. And it appears that the telephone goes to the bedroom. Parents don't know what happens and think that their children sleep, but they are throughout the whole night. There were children that slept only 4 hours. And have their phone on the whole night, or if they wake up in the night, they start watching Netflix or Insta stories from their peers. So and if you sleep poorly, the next time you have less energy for physical activity, and are also more likely to choose unhealthy foods, because you feel maybe a bit sleepy and take caffeine, sugar. So it's definitely, they are all connected. So they could also be used maybe in feedback loops to improve each other. For instance, if you engage more in sports and physical activity, you notice the bad effects of unhealthy foods and poor sleep. Yeah, so yeah, they're absolutely
maybe
connected.
to follow the flow of the topic, we are coming back to Antje, because there is one question for you. Do you also see maybe a positive effect through social media, Instagram, TikTok? Maybe for TikTok it's too early not to have systematic reviews. For children in education of healthy meals or menus to cook with family, or maybe the influence of advertisement for family cooking programs?
So we have seen that there are different channels how to use social media to shape your diet. So there's one, as you said, if I use social media and influencers, and their studies have shown that if influencers show healthy foods, there's nothing. There's no effect on intake on healthy foods later on. So that does work somehow only with the unhealthy foods. It's very unfortunate. But there are also other ways how to use devices or social networks, because you can also get social support for losing weight or reducing your weight, or weight maintenance. So that seems to work in a different way, because they support each other. They have tips, they have advices. This worked for me, try that the same. So this seems to be slightly different, but so we just started this research. I cannot say in adults it works. Adults have this kind of also feedback from their peers, and that helps them to reduce weight. I don't know how it is for the younger age groups. But I would have a question for Mai, if I'm allowed to.
Of course.
Mai, because I was thinking all the time, I mean, children, I mean, if you ask them, what would you like to do? How do you think you can improve your physical activity levels? What do you do if they only come with ideas like no seats in the bus? We want to stand in the lessons. We want standing desks. Also, when we're eating, we want to stand, and when we're not doing physical education at school, we want skateboards. So what do we do if they are only coming with these funky ideas, but we cannot transfer them into suitable, sustainable interventions? Does this encourage them?
Our experience is that children come up with really good and creative ideas, and it's maybe I didn't explain well enough that it's you work with small groups, but it's not only their ideas. They collect data among their peers and also check what works. And because you can imagine that if you have an action team with 5 children who like skateboarding, the whole playground becomes a skateboarding field. But the children are very responsible also to younger children. And so if you take them seriously, they are really responsible and also creative. And I think if we think that ideas of the children are not good ideas, we should first try it out. And that's also the action spiral. You do research into what are determinants, bring the whole system in perspective, and try to come up with actions that improve the system. And well, for most of the things, you don't know if they work, so you just try it, and if it works, you go further in that direction. If it doesn't work, maybe you try to revise it, try if it works like that, or come up with something else. Okay. So there are many ideas. It's also fun if you do groups with parents or professionals, health professionals, and children, that children always come up with much more ideas. Yeah, some ideas, they can also shoot their own ideas. Okay. For instance, come up with something, but they also know hundreds of things how to get around it to still eat the unhealthy foods or take your screen with you in bed. So they're very creative also in seeing the weak points of the actions. So yeah, our experience is that one of the school directors, when the children presented their research, one of the school directors said, "Wow, I've been such a fool. I hired a outdoor play expert to advise me on the playground, but I have a school full of outdoor play experts." So often adults don't see the huge capacity that children have. And of course, there will be ideas that don't work, but if you don't try it, you never know. Sometimes, yes, sometimes maybe, yeah, funky ideas are really, really work really well. And adults have come up already with millions of programs that didn't work. So.
Oh, thank you.
I am very interested in how you work with the children in the working groups. No, and you were talking about the facilitators or the facilitating skills of the researchers. And could you give us some details on how this is going?
Yeah, for instance, in the beginning, there's a lot of getting to know each other, and depending on the topic. For instance, if the topic is playgrounds, say you just go for walks around the playground. But for instance, also you give presentations about various research methods, so they can choose whatever they want. But yeah, many children, of course, they know that that interviews exist, or questionnaires or surveys, so, and they even can make their own surveys online. And then you tell them about informed consent and privacy, and so it's constant, and you follow them. Actually, you're more kind of a coach, where you try to keep the children in the lead, but coach them depending on what direction it goes. And for instance, if they come up with something, for instance, interviews, you can also say, well, interviews, it's very time intensive. You can only interview. So maybe you could also do this or that. And sometimes they say, oh yeah, that's a good idea. And sometimes no. And it's also not that it's the group works as a group. They all do the same thing. It's also they can split up in subgroups depending on their wishes. They don't agree always on everything. So yeah, you need to be very flexible and creative, and because every session is very well prepared, but you also always need backup plans if something doesn't work. You need sometimes they had a difficult test, or there was an event at school, and then your whole session suddenly has completely different contents. So that's why it's if someone says, oh, I did co-creation, I had 3 sessions, I think, okay, this was not really co-creation, because you need the time to build the relationship, also it's not just you and the children. You need also stakeholders. If you, for instance, if you want to change the food canteen, it's you need the people who are responsible for the school canteen. You need people who are responsible for the school canteen. So it's step by step. You work together with the children. And of course, children want fast. They want to go. They don't want to. Then they preferably, if they have an idea, they want to see it the next day. So and that's why it's good to try out things to see how it works. That also gives a lot of knowledge, and then build on it from there. So and some things children do not want to do. For instance, if you know intervention mapping, you have all these terribly boring matrices. So well, we didn't bore them with that. So we did that with intervention mapping professionals, but then presented it to them. We took them seriously we didn't kind of bypass them, but we took them seriously in does this reflect your research, and do you think we should go that way or that way? So it's a continuous, you're more kind of a coach, but it teaches you so much insights of their perspective and their world and what's important for them. And that they, for instance, regarding food, they know exactly what's healthy and what's not healthy. So that's not the point. It's more that, the unhealthy foods are cheap, so you can buy a lot and share it with your friends. That's much more important than buying for the same amount of money one apple that you cannot share. Yeah, so it's very rewarding.
Okay, there is another question, I would say, for Antje. Besides parents, peers, or social norm, school, media, what else may affect children's eating behavior? For example, on migrant children or second-generation children.
Well, we know already that the built environment also makes a difference. So we know that if there are kiosks or supermarkets around schools, they tend to buy snack foods there after school or in the breaks. So the environment plays a role. I didn't have enough time to report on all the determinants that we know already. When we look into migrant status, then it really boils down again to the education level. We have investigated also associations between healthy, unhealthy eating behaviors and also obesity risk in families with a migrant background. And there we could see that those with a high education level didn't have unhealthy diets or a higher obesity risk. So it was really still in the group with a migrant background, it was the low or high education level that played a role. So we have only the first generation because we did not look into further information. So we could I can only answer this question, that still education level is the key moment that plays a role in developing healthy or unhealthy behaviors. Does it answer the question?
I would say yes. I have now one tricky question for you three. According to what you mentioned, I see that there are different strategies in general and different models to understand why children are adopting different eating habits. But what about combining different approaches? For example, do you see incorporating food literacy in co-creation programs? Just one comment per capita.
I think I'm not doing this. I only do research as a determinant on diet, and I really see nutrition literacy, nutrition education is the key. And if we bring that further into our interventions and transport that also in the families and in the grandparents, not only for children, in their whole environment, in their peers, friends, families, neighborhoods, because children move around, they hang out with their friends somewhere outside home. And then it would be good to have also maybe advertisements on healthy literacy in the canteens, in the cafeterias, in the schools. There could be messages somewhere like carrots are good for your health, drink a lot of water. So these kind of things could be combined, I have the impression. Healthy nutrition messages should come more and hit. But maybe Mai or Jess also want to add to this.
I'll just add, like Antje did with the thumbs up, I think all of us think this is, behavior change is difficult. And so if we can come at it with the best of knowledge in different fields, I think our chances are really high. I also just think Mai's approach to really, not being a top-down approach where we look at the literature and say this is the thing that must happen because it is the, you know, it's the most important determinant, or etc. That only gets us so far without the motivation and excitement of the communities we work with who actually want to change. So I think I just think there's such great power in coming to community and saying, you have the expert in your lives. We know some of the research, but you have the expertise in your lives. I think that will move the field of family food literacy forward, nutrition interventions forward, as well as those other health behaviors. So I think it's an important move that we see more of it now, because as Mai said, for so long, we did these top-down approaches and most of them didn't work. And so I think it's quite exciting to actually, I like this thought of all together because Antje's work and where we're sitting with family food literacy and using the tools that Mai came up with, I think there's lots of exciting sort of next steps.
Yeah, and I didn't present on developing tools, measurement tools, but we also involve children in developing measurement tools because, well, what Jess said, we can look at the literature and decide this is the most important determinant, but that's probably because we now only look at determinants that are kind of measured by researchers who built these instruments, and maybe they are missing the most important determinant because they didn't think about it, or there is no instrument. And also, if you develop an instrument together with the ones who you want information on, they know what is relevant for them and what is understandable. So for me it is really valuable to do research together with children if you want to develop something for them, whether it's a measurement instrument or an action or an intervention program.
I would like to add that we are doing also research on policy evaluation in a European network. And there we wanted to see what are the indicators for food literacy on the different levels of the socioeconomics model. And we struggled already finding appropriate indicators in the monitoring and surveillance systems. So there are instruments to measure food literacy on household level, but they're from research. They are not in surveillance systems or monitoring systems. So we will have problems actually if we want to investigate maybe food promotion as a policy or policy actions for food promotion, and then to see if we can tackle unhealthy foods or ultra-processed foods and food literacy, because we don't have the indicators for health monitoring on population level or school level. So I think there's some research would be needed also to find good instruments to measure that.
Okay, so I think we are reaching the end of the webinar. So it is my duty to do some final comments, quite general in this case. For me, two important general messages. First one is that eating habits or dietary patterns are not independent of other behaviors. We should address always other that are very closely related, like physical activity, sedentary behaviors, sleep. And I like the concept of energy balance related behaviors, even if energy balance is not so simple. but this can make the link in between the different components. And I would like to thank first MDPI for organizing the webinar, for giving us this opportunity. Of course, the three speakers, you did excellent presentations and very relevant debate of the questions of the audience and also from the other speakers. And you realize that they are in the front line of research in this area. And they are not saying what they learn in articles or in books, but what they are researching in the field. And this is very, very important. And in terms of topics, they are addressing the main determinants of eating habits with a new perspective. This was the topic of the first presentation. Then two very innovative approaches to modify behaviors that are food literacy and co-creation. I suppose in the coming years, we are going to listen a lot about these strategies. This is the goal of the research specific groups are doing, but the fight for the future is also to incorporate this in the health promotion activities. So we should learn a lot from the research that is going on now to incorporate the success of these research strategies into the health promotion programs. So I think it's time to close the meeting. Thank you very much again. And I remind you that there is a special issue of the journal Nutrients exactly on this topic. So you may submit your papers until the end of December. Good afternoon, good evening, good night, and see you soon.
And I would just like to thank you, Louise, for chairing this webinar and moderating the discussion. If anyone's interested in certificates, please send us an email. Thank you to the three speakers. It was very insightful. I learned a lot, actually. Thank you very much. And yes, goodbye, everyone. Have a nice morning, evening, afternoon, wherever you are. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.